All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. As you know, this is offered part as HillmanTok University. This summer, African American History 201. We are talking about the role of the Black professional in today's movement, right? We can talk about yesteryear, and a lot of this is going to be talking about yesteryear because we have to build up, right? But what is the role today? What are we to do today? Specifically talking about Black professionals. Now, in the first lecture, week number one, we talked a good deal about sort of the foundations of the thing. We talked about how the movement, in large part, really had goals, or at least the narrative is the goals were much more about rights. Okay, so whether it be voting rights or civil rights, public accommodations, the right to do this, the right to do that. And we talked a little bit about how there are some shortcomings with that strategy, right? And so today, as Black professionals, we still are very limited because the goals and the outcomes didn't quite give us what we think we wanted. And so as we look at today, if we look at Black unemployment, if we look at Black home ownership, right, those numbers don't look very different than 1968. So we have to be critical and look at that and say, okay, what did the civil rights movement not accomplish? But the civil rights movement did accomplish some good things. Now, one of the good things about the civil rights movement is the goals were at least universal, right? That is to say, for the most part, civil rights leaders and civil rights organizations, they never had goals to help like individuals. They were saying we want voting rights for all Black people, right? It wasn't just like I'm trying to get mine. Like that wasn't the whole thing. The goals were pretty much for Black people at large. The problem today is the goals are very individual, right? So if we look at today, if we look at the energy of the movement today, very much individual. So if you look at, for example, a lot of the content creators, you look at Earn Your Leisure. Generally, you're going to get people coming on there talking about how you as an individual can make some money, how you as an individual can have a come up, how you as an individual can get rich quick. That's not really a universal goal for Black people, though, right? That's a goal for an individual. You have a lot of people talking about entrepreneurship. We got to have entrepreneurship. Again, that's a great goal for an individual. It may help the individual. It doesn't necessarily do anything for the group. And you need to understand that movement for individuals isn't novel. Okay. So I always say to this, if you go to the 1860 census, that was the last census before the Civil War, there were about 4 million Black folks enslaved in this country. But you also have 488,000 free Black people. What we're saying is there's always been a few Black people doing relatively better than the masses. There's always been a few Black people doing kind of okay. That's not new, right? So if you have some Black people who are doing better, again, that's not an achievement. That's always been the case. We talked about Dr. King in 1965, the Playboy interview he did. He says, man, the Civil Rights Act, that helped a few middle-class Black people. So again, that's not novel at all. So there's another story, which I think is very interesting. I was watching this interview that Magic Johnson gave a few years back, and he talked about his journey in business. And he talked about when he first started, nobody really believed in him. He was trying to get capital. He wanted to expand his business. And he kept going to the banks, and the banks kept saying, nah, we good. The banks didn't want to mess with him. And he went to about 7 or 8 banks. He said, everybody turned him down. And so finally, he goes to the pension funds in California. So they got all these public employees, and they put in money for their pensions. They manage those pension funds. Now, side note, Black folks don't really get opportunities to manage those funds. And a lot of state employees in most states got a lot of Black people. So that in itself is an inequality. So anyway, he goes to the pension people. He says, I want some money. And they tell Magic Johnson no 3 years in a row. So the 4th year, Magic Johnson goes and said, man, I want some money. And they said, OK, we'll give you $50 million. So with that $50 million, he buys a shopping center in the hood. He buys a shopping center for $22 million. The shopping center had a 40% occupancy rate. He gets it up to 100% occupancy rate. He sells it then for $48 million. So he makes a profit of like $26 million, and then they take him way more seriously going forward. One of the next things he does, he goes to CEO of Starbucks, Howard Schultz. He says, listen, he said, Black people, we like coffee too, but we have to drive 45 minutes to an hour outside of our community to get coffee. Now, right there, you have a problem. Magic Johnson goes and says, Black people like coffee, but we got to drive 45 minutes outside of our community to get it. And his solution was to go to Starbucks, and eventually they do a deal. They do a joint venture. They open 125 Starbucks. It's very successful. Magic Johnson sells his stake in that. Some years later, he moves on. So again, back to this current sort of MO of Black professionals, it's very individual focused. That's not to say that other Black people don't benefit. Magic Johnson helped some Black people. Some Black people got jobs. But first of all, Black people are still by and large going outside of our community to get our needs service, right? Like if we need coffee, why aren't we thinking collectively about how we can get coffee, monetize coffee, and profit collectively off of coffee? We keep doing this thing where we need to go somewhere else. But the second thing is, these were great business moves by him. But again, these are not group collective sort of projects. These are not things that advance the collective. They made Magic Johnson money. So again, we're talking about the role of the Black professional today. So we talked about lecture number one. We have to decide what are the goals. And so it is here. Are we still in a mode where we want to individually get ahead and prosper and advance our own families? By and large, that's where the Black professional is today. Again, the Black professional, go back to lecture number one, benefited more than anyone from the Civil Rights Acts. The Black professional was able to get more access, but it didn't advance Black people. And with that access today, Black professionals are, by and large, carrying that forward and saying, how do we find opportunities for ourselves? How do we get jobs? How do we advance our careers? And how do we do some deals? So what are we actually trying to do here? So we have to kind of look at this critically, right? And so if we look at the Civil Rights Movement, again, we always have to go back to the Civil Rights Movement. What happened there? Let's analyze that. What you had there is a situation where people felt so, I mean, it was pretty bad. I think we failed to appreciate today the courage that it took for people to just stand up for themselves, right? Because they're living in a society where people are quite literally hung from trees just for speaking up. People are literally hung from trees because they have the audacity to just act human. I always tell the story from the book, The Warmth of Other Suns. In 1948, there was a farmer who had a water bill. He goes to pay the water bill. He asked for a receipt, and they beat that man down for asking for a receipt. That's the world that they lived in. So when these people go out and they protest or they participate in demonstrations, we have to understand that it was a very courageous act on their part. That's not a small thing. So it's not very likely that they understood, okay, so once you cross that hurdle, then what? Because when you're living in that type of terror, you can't really imagine anything else. Like you maybe you're not thinking of the next 2 or 3 steps. So here we are, the next 2 or 3 steps ahead, and we're still sort of operating under the same type of ideology. Like if I could just sit in the front of the bus and have access, okay, you have access, but Black unemployment, infant mortality, all those numbers are still the same. So did you really advance? And I'm submitting that one of the things is there's no concept of the group and the collective moving forward and no plan for that. Now, later in this course, we'll get to someone who did have a plan and a real strategy for the group. And we have actually a really special guest, and we'll talk about that later in the semester, but we have a guest scholar from Spelman College who will be lecturing on that. I'm really excited, but we'll get into that later. But let's come back to this. What is the plan for the collective? By and large, again, if you go to Earn Your Leisure, you go to some of the other content creators, they're only talking about how you can have a come up. And again, that's not unique. You've always had a Black middle class. You've always had some Black folks doing well. And is it no wonder that we kind of keep spinning our wheels in the same place? Because Black professionals are still thinking very much on an individual track and not the group. So what does that look like? What does it look like to have a group concept? What does it look like to have a plan for the group? Well, I would submit to you that in the history of this country, probably the best example of that would be Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Now, I don't want to get too far into that because, again, I have an actual for real expert in that who's going to really lay that down in a few weeks later. But if you go through the whole thing, for the most part, we don't have that, right? If you look at Dr. King's work, what you see is a lot of integration, right? We want access. If you look at even civil rights organizations today, do you see anyone with a viable economic plan, a viable blueprint to advance the group, to have more control, to have more power? No, you see rights, you see people talking about jobs. Well, if you think critically about this, Black people have been talking about jobs for a very long time. Go back to the March on Washington. What was it called? The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? We've been talking about jobs for a long time. A. Philip Randolph had been planning marches on Washington since the 40s. First, they wanted to integrate the defense industry, right? And Eisenhower actually caved on that. And so they ended up not doing that march. And so, again, that's another story. But you get the point. We've been talking about jobs primarily for, middle class Black people for a long time. There's no group concept. And so today we have the NAACP, National Urban League. I'll give anybody $10 right now if you can tell me what is their actual group plan, right? They come out with white papers to tell you what's wrong, but is there actually a plan to advance the group, the collective? I don't like, in fact, let's just break it down. If I ask the average Black person, what does the National Urban League do? Could you tell me? If I ask the average Black person, what does the NAACP do day to day? Could you tell me? Right. But again, that's not new either. So if you go back, there's this big tension between Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. Marcus Garvey is this guy from Jamaica. He's dark skinned. He goes to meet with Du Bois and NAACP folks. He walks in, and the first thing he notices, everybody in here is like light skinned and almost white, right? And the NAACP just seems to be doing the bougie kind of like, let's just sort of talk about integration and having access. And Marcus doesn't like Du Bois, and Du Bois doesn't like him, right? That's a very long story, but you get the point. For a very long time, there's been that frustration with Black organizations. And in fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, he actually walks out of the NAACP for that reason. During even the Great Depression, Du Bois looks at it and says, man, people are really struggling here, and we're talking about integration. People need a sandwich. Like, what are we doing? So again, it's not a new thing, but we're still kind of going around the same cycle. And so today, for Black professionals, we have to kind of think critically with all of our resources and with all of our knowledge and all of our education. Are we thinking critically about the group? And what does it look like to have a plan, not for some individuals and not just a small number of us, but a group? And frankly, individuals can't do that. You need organizations. And so the conversation needs to be, how do Black professionals influence Black organizations to do something higher, to take a different course and a different approach? Because the one that we have, frankly, just isn't working. And we have enough history to say it's probably never going to work. If anyone is in a position to influence Black organizations, it would be Black professionals. So first of all, we have to be active in our organizations. We have to sit down and talk with them. And yes, we have to bring money, because the reality is Black organizations can't really afford to do all the radical things that Black people might like, because Black people don't fund them. The National Urban League is waiting on Comcast and a bunch of other corporations to write the checks. So there's a reason why Elijah Muhammad could be way more radical with his approach, because he was funded by his followers. So we have to come back to the table with dollars and an agenda for the collective to present to Black organizations so that they can organize Black masses of people. All right. So again, this summer, we will be going several weeks now. We're going to talk about the role of the Black professional in today's movement. I hope these are uplifting. I hope they're enlightening. Again, I want to always keep them short. I want to keep them interesting. And I love to hear your feedback. But we will be back next week with another lecture, HillmanTok University. I'll talk to you all soon.